This video is on the history of genetics. I hope you enjoy. The first experiment in the 1800s pertaining to genetics was done by a monk known as Gregor Mendel, and he experimented on the pea plant. Later in the 1900s, the fruit fly was used as a model organism by Thomas Hunt Morgan, who continued the work of Mendel, and he contributed to a lot of the genetics that we know and study today. The fruit flies were easier to study than plants because they had generations and they multiplied rapidly. He looked at how fruit flies gave their trait and how inheritance worked. Their chromosomes were easier to study also. Modern scientists have gone on to study the genetics of bacteria, yeast, and viruses. Viruses being the simplest of them all. Although they are not living, they have very simple genetic makeup with one circular piece of DNA or RNA. When Darwin in the mid-1800s formed his theory of evolution, he did not know how and where the traits of organisms were stored. He proposed how nature selects for variation in traits or the observable characteristics of organisms, but he did not even propose how the cells of organisms were controlling these traits. Mendel, at about the same time as Darwin, had shown how plants passed on their traits, but he also did not know what in the cells of an organism were responsible for those traits. Scientists knew about chromosomes, but they didn't really have an idea of what these did. Darwin established that all species of life had descended over time from common ancestry and proposed the scientific theory that this branching pattern of evolution resulted from a process that he called natural selection. He published his theory with compelling evidence of evolution in his 1859 book on the origin of science. The scientific community and much of the general public came to accept evolution as a fact in his lifetime. Although it was not until the emergence of the modern evolutionary synthesis from the 1930s to the 1950s that a broad consensus developed that natural selection was the basic mechanism of evolution. In modified form, Darwin's discovery is the unifying theory of the life sciences, explaining the diversity of life. Gregor Mendel was an Austrian monk and a scientist who gained fame as the figurehead of the new science of genetics for his study of the inheritance of certain traits in pea plants. He showed that the inheritance of traits followed particular laws, which he later named after himself. The significance of his work was left unnoticed until the turn of the 20th century. The independent rediscovery of these laws formed the foundation of the modern science of genetics. After the rediscovery of Mendel's work, scientists tried to determine which molecules in a cell were responsible for inheritance. In 1910, Thomas Hunt Morgan argued that genes are on chromosomes, based on observations of a sex-linked white eye mutation in fruit flies. In 1913, his student Alfred Sturtevant used the phenomenon of genetic linkage to show that genes are arranged linearly on the chromosomes. Although genes were known to exist on chromosomes, chromosomes are composed of both protein and DNA. Scientists didn't know which of these two were responsible for inheritance. In 1928, Frederick Griffith discovered the phenomenon of transformation where he found that dead bacteria could transfer genetic material to transform other still living bacteria traits that the dead bacteria had. 16 years later, in 1944, Oswald Theodore Avery, Colin MacLeod, and Macklin McMarty identified the molecule responsible for transformation as DNA. The Hershey Chase experiment in 1952 also showed that DNA rather than protein is the genetic material of the viruses that in fact infect bacteria, providing further evidence that DNA is the molecule responsible for inheritance. James D. Watson and Francis Crick, the brains of the effort, determined the structure of DNA in 1953 using the X-ray crystallography work of Rosalind Franklin, for which they gave her little credit, and Maurice Wilkins that indicated DNA had a helical structure. So how important are genes? We once thought that genes were the main controlling factors in inheritance, and that nearly all biological functions of organisms are controlled by genes. We now believe that genes, the DNA sequence that code for a protein, are just one of a dizzying array of genetic controlling factors. One lesson, I must say, that all scientists learned from studying genetics was that nothing is as simple as it seems.